I'm sort of throwing some ideas out there and trying with retroactive activity to make it sound coherent, but whether it does, it's yours to judge by the end of it. I'm working, as Chris said, this is part of my biography of the lives, plural, of Otto Jekyll, and Otto Jekyll is one of these figures which we talked about, where everything just happens in XXL. My favorite example is always that his conflict with his landlord ends up in the landlord shutting the chimney so that the family will suffocate by carbon monoxide poisoning. And it's a sort of change of that sort of event. So it's a really fun biography to write, although I'm in contact with the family, so I have to keep back the ecstatics for sometimes. I'm going to try to do this using the mouse. And if I'm very gingerly, okay, moving it, it should work. Monstrosity, yeah, well, I think Mark's talk and mine are connected very, 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 very loosely indeed. If Mark is going to do anything even similar to what he presented at the exhibit yesterday, but what I'm going to talk about is the rich history of the chimera, the assembled animal in paleontology, starting from the idea of how ideas and concept gets accepted as common knowledge. And there's usually the requirement of an existing demand for a certain concept, or the existing demand for, in this case, a certain object. I'm showing here a composite taxidermic specimen, and this is not entirely unlike what we'll be encountering later on. In the case of Hydrarchus harlani, a sort of assembled sea snake from the 1840s, it responds to the demand for more about sea snakes, which were the sort of animal that were very sought after, very en vogue in the 1840s, 1830s, and even 1850s. And with a clever businessman that really knew how to exploit that market by using both religious and scientific language in order to produce something that could support a commercial enterprise. Another example that you could name is Eoanthropus, a piled-down man. Something that was created very clearly to produce a British hominin in the early 20th century, just after France and Switzerland and Germany got their own Neanderthals. And then, in second instance, also produced a very profit-earning commercial enterprise in selling copies of Eoanthropus. So there's various aspects to that. And then there is, of course, our Brontochimerosaurus. And here, I hope Paul won't object with my... We'll see. Brontochimerosaurus is really Brontosaurus produced in the American Museum in New York in 1905. With the skull not from, actually, if I recall correctly, a skull was found in the vicinity of this particular specimen, but it was not associated with it. And I always like to think that part of the reason for that is that Brontosaurus's reputation as a sort of fat diplodocus made a more boxy skull more likely, or at least more attractive, than the more elongated shape that we now know Apatosaurus / Brontosaurus / whatever had, which looked much more like the skull of Diplodocus, only wider. The final introductory example I would give was an animal called Agathaumas, actually the first Triceratopsian ever found under the direction of Edward Drinker Cope in the early Bone Wars in 1872, consisting of mainly only postcranial material, which was then combined by Cope with remains of monoclonius Phaeocerus in the early 1890s to produce this. This is an image by Charles Knight, produced in collaboration with Cope in 1897, which shows both the spines of what later probably was Triceratops and the cranial material from Monoclonius. And Cope could be a bit fickle about associations of various animals, as we'll see. Now, what's interesting about Agathaumas is that it not really caught on as a liable scenario for the origin of these specimens, but on the other hand proved to be unexpectedly difficult to get rid of. I think Will said if you got something going on in the public domain, it's very difficult to get rid of it after a while. Brontosaurus is a good example, and even Agathaumas we see in Harry Hoyt's Lost World of 1925, well after it's really been discredited as a scientific specimen. Let us go to Dimetrodon, everyone's favorite pelycosaur. And as we might, as anyone who's ever been through a Schleich catalogue or a natural history museum might testify, as much a dinosaur in a lot of the public mind as Tyrannosaurus rex or Triceratops. Now, Dimetrodon itself was discovered in 1877 and described by Edward Drinker Cope. I'm not entirely, this is the only image that I've been able to find. I don't know whether it is found in matrix like this. This is an image from 1907 in a monograph by Ermine Case. A couple of years later, Cope also found some cranial material, crushed cranial material, which he ascribed to the genus Edaphosaurus. And here we see one of Cope's few live reconstructions, if one might call it that, of Dimetrodon on the bottom and Neosaurus at the top. And Neosaurus was based on remains found in 1895, 1896, which lacked a skull. Again, it's the atlas, the vertebra connecting the skull to the spine. That's really the fault of a lot of misunderstanding in paleontology, and one of the better reasonings against the supreme creator, as far as I'm concerned. So what this is just after that, Cope creates this picture, and what we see as the big difference here is not so much the skull, which Cope always assumed would be very close to the carnivorous skull of Dimetrodon, but rather the sail. It was of a different form. It was all the spines instead, if in the case of Dimetrodon going upwards, were bent rather backwards, and they had a sort of mast arms. Neosaurus literally means ship lizard, ship reptile. And in the beginning, Cope saw that as fairly literal, thinking of something like this, because the mast arms are actually quite wide. He didn't maintain, this is by the way of a page by Eric Kowalik called Science Ruined Dinosaurs, which gave a number of examples of how popular culture often produces much more exciting fossil animals than we do. To his credit, he didn't maintain that view for a very long time, but he did think that it was a mollusk-eating marine form. And it's always interesting to me how whenever paleontologists don't really know what to do with something, they put it in the water. A bit like how cultural anthropologists tend to regard anything they can't recognize as an ancestor, a figure or something like that. But let's not distract ourselves too much. So, together with Cope, Charles Knight in 1896, 1897 produced an image of this this animal, which is basically, as we now recognize it, an Edaphosaurus with a Dimetrodon skull. Now, this is a slightly problematic one because, as you will notice, all the spines are upright, not bent backwards, as it. Oh God, already. And there's a very Brinkman-esque feel here. And so there was and this is what Knight tended to do. He sculpted some figures first, and then he drew his paintings based on those. This is also an image that later was produced as a piece of merchandise for the American Museum in a series of statuettes to be sold to visitors. This is the image that Charles Knight produces in 1897. It doesn't exist in this form today, And now we will get at why that isn't. This was reproduced in a journal of the time, a magazine of the time. And we can see Neosaurus with slightly more backward bent sail in front and the Metrodon at the back. In the beginning of the 20th century, 1907, the American Museum decides to make an exhibit of Neosaurus, for which Knight again produces a statuette. One is he's seen working on here. And which is then also used, where you can see that the backward bend of the spines is much clearer. He did this in close collaboration with people at the DVP, the Department of Vertebrate Paleontology at the American Museum, also to be exhibited near the mounted skeleton of Neosaurus as it was published in 1907. He subsequently produced a painting to be reproduced on the Scientific American cover. Now this is something that Scientific American did pretty regularly. When the American Museum had new exhibits, they would accompany that with an issue, a cover issue, around that time. The connections between Scientific American's editorial board and the American Museum was excellent, so there are a number of examples of that, and also a number of specimens of Charles Knight's art. In also 1907, Ermine Locow's case. This is a much later photo. This is a photograph of Case at a later age, but he's at about 30. In his 30s, produces a re-evaluation of the Palaeosaurus of North America, in which he argues that Neosaurus, at best, is a very dubious specimen, and tries to tie its remains to Cope's already described Edaphosaurus. It should be said that this statue was also sold to museums, not so much to private parties, but to museums as an exchange subject. And what we can see is that Knight in the court, we don't know exactly when, changes Neosaurus to Edaphosaurus and associates the skull with the same, with the original of the same statuette. This is probably not after Case's more extensive re-evaluation of Neosaurus and Edaphosaurus in 1916. And we can also see that this painting changes to this painting already fairly early, around 1911, when the first doubts around the validity of Neosaurus come up. And we can see that this has become the Metrodon, and here we can see the mast arms of a typical Neosaurus' sail. So just swip the two around. Sorry?
Could you do that again? Show that again.
No. Oh, yeah, I see.
Yeah, there. Yeah.
So this is the original. Look at, see the little points here, and the clean sail there, and then you see that he's changed one to the other. So the old painting is still beneath the new one. He did a lot more on Palaeosaurus subsequently. This is in the Field Museum in Chicago. I'm not entirely sure about the dates here, but I thought this was around about right. Yes. This is what I found anyway. Okay, so this is what I want to present, like the introduction to the history of Neosaurus and the way in which this animal was received in the American paleontology community, then adapted to reflect new insight. Now, what is interesting, if I tie that to my subject, Otto Jekyll, this is a later portrait from 1929, is to see how different this whole concept is filled in Europe. Jekyll was a vertebrate paleontologist who first worked at the Natural History Museum in Berlin, subsequently in Greifswald in North Germany, but we get to that, and who is part of this whole, of a new kind of European paleontology that strives towards a closer integration of paleontology with zoology rather than geology, in Germany it was traditionally set within a geological organizational framework. What Jekyll and people like Otto Abel and Louis Dollo in Belgium try to do is to get to more paleobiological approach. I'll really hurry up now. In 1906, near Heslich in Saxony, Jekyll discovers this fossil of Neosaurus critneri, which still exists in Saxonian Geological Museum in Freiburg, and takes that with him to Greifswald, where he'd just been appointed professor of vertebrate paleontology and geology at the university, after having left Berlin in rather difficult circumstances, but why that is I've already explained. And he actually makes his own wax cast of this fossil. So nowadays all the bone has been removed from this fossil. What you see here is the imprint of it, but the bone itself is no longer there. No one knows where it is. But we can see from the wax print that it's still, the material is still present. And this is the counter slab of the cast, so the second generation cast that's been made. And at that moment, Jekyll is part of a German drive to reevaluate basically all paleontological information. And there are two good reasons for that, and the most clear example is what I've already described about Diplodocus, how they try to lizardize the way in which Diplodocus is built. But there are two causes. The first is scientific expansion and reform attempts by the German Empire, which just offers more job opportunities, gives the country more confidence in scientific terms, and tries to not longer rely on American or UK knowledge for and rather determine their own theories about past and extinct life. And the second is, of course, the Tendaguru, the discovery of large dinosaur bones in the German colony of East Africa, which forces the Germans to really have their own thoughts about these animals, because suddenly they've become their own. A bit like the Belgians do with Bernissar, obviously. So what we basically get is a re-evaluation of everything that's been written about paleontology, and this is one of the most clear illustrations. The Agathaumas that I already could describe is sort of being reconstructed by Heinrich Harder in the form of a more hunched Agathaumas. And Jekyll starts on the same work on Neosaurus. This is all Jekyll's own drawings, although I've got the impression that this was based on a different drawing. And the most clear here in this form of iconoclasm is that he really doesn't go along with the idea of a sail. It's a very methodological, zoological way of going about how to present and to accept evidence, and he said that no one has presented any evidence in the fossils that there should be a sail. So we should at least consider the possibility that it wasn't, and what could it then be used for? Now, Jekyll's solution is as a defensive mechanism. So, and this is called Otto's hedgehog, Otto's eagle. And what Jekyll assumes is that Neosaurus could sort of curl into a ball and point all its sticks outward as a defense against all sorts of predators. I can clearly see that this illustration has engendered this one. And this is published in 1910. And this then gets a whole new role in Germany, in scientific notebooks, in scientific dictionaries, etc. Even long, and we can see this is 1910, so this is some time after Case has sort of called the whole existence of Neosaurus into question, and it's also extending to Dimetrodon. Well, if one doesn't have a sail, why should the other? And already in 1908, Jekyll asks for a model, this very model, which still exists in Greifswald, by the way, in a copy of the image of Neosaurus that we saw Knight working on, and then uses that also to measure the animal and further comment on it. It's really used as a scientific specimen, this particular model. And it then gets continued time and time again. By the time that we're here talking here, this is the cover of the front of the Berlin Aquarium, where we get Neosaurus reproduced in a very Jekyllian way. And this is probably, this Edaphosaurus is probably a 1980. It was reconstructed in the 1980s, and it was probably originally called Neosaurus in 1930, 1940. It was bombed to bits in 1944 and then reconstructed in the 1980s. We can also see that it has a very rich, it's almost like a Japanese woodblock painting in the way that it is portrayed. And that probably has to do with the relationship between these two people. So we see Jekyll in the middle, Jekyll's friend Eugenbracht, Jekyll to the left, Eugenbracht in the middle, and Heinrich Harder. Well, this isn't Heinrich Harder, but there's no photo of Heinrich Harder. I thought I'd better show someone there. So this is the painter Walter Thor, who was also a friend of Otto Jekyll. And Harder here, who is a pupil of Bracht, who is a friend of Jekyll. So you can see, I'll make it a longer last minute. We can see that this image gets continue perpetuated in especially popular culture, because the Germans, even if the German paleontological circle was also quite small, they were very good at playing into the popular channels. So what we see is a very, now we're really going the wrong way, is that it gets continued time and time again, even after the Second World War, in all sorts of popular channels. This is Neosaurus in the Czech Republic. So this is in France, and this is in Poland after the Second World War. And these were all collector's cards you can collect with either chocolate or cigarettes, or both. This is another one which I'm going to run through very briefly. This is a wall painting in a school in Amsterdam, where we can see Neosaurus here. Yeah, the photograph's not perfect, but believe me if I say it's there. Also included a little picture that Mark will recognize of Allosaurus chewing on a vertebra. And not until later is the existence of what we now see as Edaphosaurus recognized even by people like Jekyll, by other workers in Germany, really after the Second World War. And the last thing that I really want to close up with, and then I think the minute's done, I see Chris nodding, is, and this is a bit of conjecture obviously, but what I've noticed is that if you look, it's really difficult to realize how much of a pinhead Edaphosaurus really is. If you look at the size of the skull, if you look at it from a distance, you could easily imagine it doesn't have a head at all. And still, you see that few of the reconstructions ever, there's still sort of Neosaurus-y like, I like to think. The heads usually in kind of reconstructions of Edaphosaurus is still way too big. I don't know whether that has, well, yeah, it is usually also portrayed as the antithesis of Dimetrodon, a bit like Triceratops is of Tyrannosaurus, all these apex predators versus plant eaters, language. Oh yeah, and yeah, that's what I want to close off. So there may still be a bit of Neosaurus in a lot of Edaphosaurus reconstructions that I know. Okay, this is the last. Thanks for listening, and buy the book.